When we think of the Second World War, the black-clad Schutzstaffel, or SS, often comes to mind as the ultimate symbol of Nazi cruelty. They were the fanatical enforcers of Hitler's ideology, the guards of the concentration camps, and the perpetrators of countless atrocities across Europe. Their double lightning bolt insignia became a mark of pure terror, representing a cold, bureaucratic, and industrial form of killing that defined the Holocaust. For many, the SS represents the absolute worst of humanity, a group that abandoned all moral compass in service of a hateful regime. They were the political soldiers of the Third Reich, and their crimes have rightly earned them a place of infamy in the darkest chapters of our history. Yet, within the vast and brutal machinery of the Nazi state, there existed a unit so depraved, so utterly consumed by violence and sadism, that it managed to shock even the hardened commanders of the SS itself. This was the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, a penal battalion that became a byword for unrestrained savagery. Its story is not just one of war crimes, but of a deliberate descent into the abyss of human behavior, sanctioned from the very top. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not an accident or an anomaly. It was a weapon, forged from the worst elements of society and unleashed upon civilian populations with devastating and terrifying results. To understand this unit is to confront a different kind of evil. It was not the cold, detached cruelty of an administrator signing death warrants, but the hot, chaotic, and personal violence of men who delighted in inflicting pain. They were not just soldiers following orders, they were criminals, rapists, and murderers given a uniform and a license to indulge their darkest impulses. Their actions in Poland, Belarus, and finally Warsaw were so horrific that they caused disgust and alarm among the very people who had set them loose. This is the story of a unit that operated beyond the pale, in a league of its own wickedness. Studying the Dirlewanger Brigade is a deeply uncomfortable but necessary task. It forces us to look at the extremes of what can happen when a state not only permits but actively encourages brutality. It reveals how the veneer of civilization can be stripped away, leaving behind a horrifying capacity for violence that exists within humanity. The history of this unit serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which people can sink when ideology and power combine to remove all restraints, creating a force of pure destruction that left nothing but scorched earth and mass graves in its wake. This is a journey into the heart of darkness. Before we proceed into the detailed history of this notorious unit, a clear and serious warning is necessary for every reader. The events that will be described in the following sections are not abstract historical facts. They are accounts of extreme and disturbing violence. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade is filled with graphic descriptions of mass murder, sexual violence, torture, and cruelty inflicted upon men, women, and children. These are not subjects to be taken lightly, and the details can be profoundly upsetting. It is important to approach this material with a sense of gravity and respect for the victims whose suffering it documents. This essay aims to be factual and informative, not sensational. The purpose of detailing these atrocities is not to shock for the sake of it, but to provide an honest and unflinching look at what this unit was and what it did. History, in its truest form, must confront the uncomfortable truths of the past. By understanding the specific nature of these crimes, we can better comprehend the ideology that allowed them to happen and the human cost of such state-sanctioned barbarism. We will handle these difficult topics as sensitively as possible, but the very nature of the subject matter is inherently brutal and horrifying. The men of the Dirlewanger Brigade were responsible for some of the most appalling war crimes of the Second World War. Their methods involved the systematic destruction of entire communities and the murder of civilians on a massive scale. We will discuss events like the burning of villages with their inhabitants locked inside and the slaughter of hospital patients and staff. These are not easy things to read about, and they should not be. The discomfort we feel is a testament to our own humanity and a small, inadequate echo of the terror experienced by those who face this unit. Therefore, please proceed with caution and be prepared for the difficult content ahead. This is a dark part of our shared human story, and it demands to be told with honesty and sobriety. Its lessons are vital, reminding us of the fragility of peace and the terrifying potential that lies dormant when moral and legal boundaries are erased. The goal is to learn from this history, to honor the memory of the victims by refusing to forget, and to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. To understand the monstrous nature of the unit, we must first look at the man whose name it carried, Oskar Dirlewanger. His life story reads like a case study in moral collapse. Born in 1895, Dirlewanger was a product of the First World War. He served on the Western Front, where he was wounded multiple times and decorated with Germany's prestigious Iron Cross, both first and second class. The brutalizing experience of trench warfare seemed to ignite a permanent thirst for violence within him. After the war, he refused to return to civilian life, instead joining the Freikorps, the violent right-wing paramilitary groups that terrorized the fledgling Weimar Republic. Despite his violent tendencies, Dirlewanger was an educated man. He managed to earn a doctorate in political science in 1922, a detail that makes his later actions even more chilling. This was not an unthinking brute, but an intelligent individual who consciously chose a path of criminality and depravity. Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, he was repeatedly in trouble with the law, facing charges for financial crimes and illegal possession of weapons. He joined the Nazi Party early on, but his unstable and criminal nature made him a liability even within a movement that celebrated aggression. His complete downfall came in 1934. Dirlewanger was convicted for the statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl, a member of the League of German Girls. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and the conviction resulted in him being stripped of his university doctorate, his military honors, and his position in the Nazi Party. He was, by all accounts, a disgraced outcast. Yet, in the twisted logic of the Third Reich, his very disgrace would become his ticket back to power. An old Freikorps comrade, the high-ranking SS official Gottlob Berger, saw a use for a man like Dirlewanger. Dirlewanger's character, a blend of decorated war hero, academic violent criminal, and convicted sex offender, was the perfect storm for the kind of commander the SS would need for its dirtiest work. He was cruel, lacked any moral compass, and was desperate to redeem himself in the eyes of the regime. He possessed a deep-seated sadism and a contempt for human life that would become the defining characteristics of the unit he was destined to lead. His personal depravity would be amplified on a massive scale, shaping his command into a reflection of his own monstrous personality. The creation of the Dirlewanger unit began with a strange and cynical idea. In 1940, Gottlob Berger, now the chief of staff for SS leader Heinrich Himmler, successfully petitioned for Dirlewanger's rehabilitation. Berger proposed a unique concept, a special military unit composed of convicted poachers. The official rationale was that poachers were skilled hunters, expert marksmen, and masters of tracking and woodcraft. These skills, Berger argued, would make them ideal soldiers for fighting partisans, who often operated from the dense forests of Eastern Europe. It was a seemingly logical, if unconventional plan to turn criminals into useful assets for the war effort. Himmler, intrigued by the idea, approved the formation of the Wilddieb-Kommando Oranienburg, or Poacher Commando Oranienburg. Oskar Dirlewanger, the disgraced but supposedly rehabilitated war veteran, was appointed as its commander. This was his chance to prove his loyalty and ruthlessness to the regime that had cast him out. The initial recruits were men who had been imprisoned for violating Germany's strict hunting laws. While seemingly less dangerous than other criminals, these poachers were still men who operated outside the law, possessed a familiarity with violence, and were now being offered a pardon in exchange for military service. The unit was first deployed to the general government, the Nazi-occupied territory of Poland, ostensibly for anti-partisan duties. It quickly became clear, however, that the Poacher Commando had little interest in disciplined military operations. Reports from the very beginning documented rampant indiscipline, constant drunkenness, and a complete lack of military bearing. More alarmingly, the unit immediately engaged in looting civilian property, committing random acts of murder against Poles and Jews, and perpetrating sexual assaults. Their behavior was less that of a military unit and more that of a rampaging gang of thugs. Instead of being disbanded for its criminal behavior, the unit's actions were seen as a useful tool of terror by the SS High Command. The fear and chaos they spread among the civilian population was considered an effective, if crude, method of control. Himmler and Berger saw potential in Dirlewanger's brutal approach. They decided that the experiment was a success, not in spite of its criminality, but because of it. The Poacher Commando was not just tolerated, it was set to be expanded, paving the way for it to become one of the most infamous formations of the entire war. Following their initial deployment in Poland, the Dirlewanger unit was transferred to Belarus in early 1942. This move, honestly, marked a significant escalation in both the unit's size and its savagery. The partisan war in Belarus was particularly brutal, and the German command was, well, willing to use any means necessary to crush the resistance. It was here that Heinrich Himmler made a fateful decision. He authorized Oskar Dirlewanger to expand his recruitment pool far beyond convicted poachers. Dirlewanger was now permitted to recruit directly from Germany's prisons and later from the concentration camps themselves, offering criminals a chance at freedom through combat. Crucially, the men recruited were not political prisoners or conscientious objectors. They were hardened, violent criminals convicted of the most serious offenses: murder, armed robbery, arson, and rape. The unit also began to accept men who had been deemed clinically insane or who had severe psychological disorders. Himmler's logic was as simple as it was horrifying: to fight what he called subhuman bandits, the partisans, he needed subhuman soldiers. He believed that only the most morally bankrupt individuals could effectively wage the kind of merciless war of annihilation he envisioned for the Eastern Front. With this new influx of violent recruits, the unit rapidly degenerated. What little military discipline had existed completely evaporated, replaced by a culture of pure sadism and criminality. The Dirlewanger Brigade, as it was now becoming known, attracted the worst of the worst. It became a magnet for SS members facing court-martial for other crimes, who were offered a chance to avoid punishment by serving under Dirlewanger. The unit became a dumping ground for the most unstable and violent elements within the entire Nazi system, a collection of men united only by their capacity for extreme cruelty. The Nazi leadership was fully aware of the unit's nature. Reports of their atrocities flowed back to headquarters, but they were consistently ignored or excused. The brigade was seen as a necessary evil, a specialized tool for pacifying occupied territories through sheer terror. Its members were expendable, and their horrific methods were deemed effective in demoralizing any population that might consider supporting the partisans. The expansion of the unit was a conscious choice by the Nazi leadership to weaponize criminality, unleashing a force that they knew would operate without any moral or legal restraint whatsoever. In the blood-soaked lands of occupied Belarus, the Dirlewanger Brigade perfected its unique and horrifying brand of warfare. Their primary mission was not to engage in direct combat with organized partisan groups, which would have required military skill and discipline they did not possess. Instead, they focused on liquidating the civilian population that was suspected of supporting the resistance. They developed a systematic method for destroying villages, a chillingly repetitive process that was carried out over and over again. This was not random violence. It was a calculated strategy of mass murder, designed to wipe out the partisan support base. Their standard operating procedure was brutally simple and effective. The unit would surround a chosen village, cutting off all escape routes. The soldiers would then sweep through the houses, forcing every single inhabitant, men, women, children, and the elderly, out into the open. The terrified civilians would be herded together and forced into a large building, typically a wooden barn, the local church, or a schoolhouse. Once everyone was packed inside, the doors were barred and barricaded from the outside. The building was then doused with gasoline and set on fire, burning everyone inside alive. To ensure there were no survivors, the Dirlewanger men would set up machine guns around the burning structure. Anyone who managed to break through a window or a weakened wall in a desperate attempt to escape the inferno was immediately shot down. The soldiers reportedly treated these massacres as sport, often drinking heavily while they carried out their work. In Belarus alone, historians estimate that the Dirlewanger Brigade destroyed at least 200 villages in this manner. The total number of civilians they murdered in these operations is estimated to be over 120,000. It was a campaign of pure extermination. Another of the unit's signature atrocities was its method for clearing minefields. Rather than using trained engineers or specialized equipment, the brigade developed a far more cynical and cruel tactic. They would round up local civilians from nearby villages and force them to walk, often arm in arm in dense human waves, across suspected minefields. These unwilling human minesweepers would trigger the explosives with their own bodies, clearing a safe path for the German soldiers to follow. This practice perfectly encapsulated the unit's philosophy, a complete and utter contempt for human life and a preference for sadistic solutions over conventional military tactics. The culmination of the Dirlewanger Brigade's reign of terror occurred in August 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising. When the Polish Home Army rose up against the German occupiers, Himmler was enraged. He issued a direct order that was shocking in its scope. Warsaw was to be razed to the ground, and its entire population was to be killed. No prisoners were to be taken, and no distinction was to be made between combatants and civilians. It was an order for genocide, intended to make Warsaw a terrifying example to the rest of occupied Europe. To carry out this monstrous task, he deployed his most reliable butchers, the Dirlewanger Brigade. On August 5, 1944, the brigade entered the Wola district of Warsaw, and what followed was one of the single most concentrated massacres of the Second World War. The unit, now reinforced with more criminals and operating alongside the equally brutal Kamiński Brigade, began a systematic slaughter. They did not seek out Polish fighters. Instead, they moved from street to street, house to house, and simply executed every Polish man, woman, and child they found. Civilians were dragged from their homes and shot in courtyards. Hand grenades were thrown into cellars where families were hiding. The savagery knew no bounds. The Dirlewanger men stormed the district's hospitals, places that should have been sanctuaries under any rule of warfare. They murdered the doctors and nurses and then went from bed to bed, shooting and killing the patients, including pregnant women and newborn babies. They broke into churches, massacring priests, nuns, and the civilians who had sought refuge inside. The Wola district became a landscape of hell, filled with burning buildings, mass execution sites, and the bodies of tens of thousands of innocent people. In just a few days, the Dirlewanger Brigade and other German units murdered an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 civilians in this single district. This was not a battle, it was a methodical extermination. The soldiers were frequently drunk, engaging in widespread rape and looting as they killed. They moved through the city with a cold, mechanical efficiency, their actions driven by a mixture of ideological hatred, sadism, and the promise of plunder. The Wola massacre stands as the ultimate expression of the Dirlewanger Brigade's purpose. They were not soldiers fighting a war, they were a death squad let loose upon a trapped population, and they fulfilled their gruesome mission with a depravity that left an indelible scar on the history of the 20th century. The atrocities committed by the Dirlewanger Brigade in Warsaw were so profoundly shocking that they provoked a rare reaction, disgust, and protest from within the German command structure itself. This is perhaps the most telling detail about the unit's absolute depravity. The SS was an organization built on brutality, and its officers were men hardened by years of war and complicity in the Holocaust. Yet what they witnessed in Warsaw crossed a line even for them. The chaotic, drunken, and sadistic nature of the killings, combined with the rampant looting and sexual violence, was seen as not only monstrous but also counterproductive to the military effort. The German commander in charge of suppressing the uprising, SS Obergruppenführer Erich von Dembach-Zelewski, was himself a man with a brutal reputation in anti-partisan warfare. However, he was horrified by the conduct of Dirlewanger's men. He complained to his superiors that their actions were undermining military discipline and turning the operation into a chaotic bloodbath that served no strategic purpose. He noted that their primary motivation seemed to be plunder and the satisfaction of their basest instincts, not the suppression of the uprising. Even a man tasked with crushing Warsaw found the Dirlewanger method to be an abomination. Other German army commanders on the scene were equally appalled. They saw a unit that was not only committing unspeakable crimes but was also militarily useless. The Dirlewanger Brigade was ineffective at fighting the actual Polish resistance fighters, preferring to murder unarmed civilians who could not fight back. Their indiscipline and drunken rampages were a liability. The army's complaints eventually reached the highest levels, highlighting the fact that Dirlewanger's force was operating outside any recognizable code of military conduct, even the elastic and brutal standards of the Nazi Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Despite these protests, Himmler continued to protect Dirlewanger. He praised the unit's success and even awarded Dirlewanger the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his role in the Warsaw Massacre. The fact that other SS and army commanders, men who were themselves war criminals, found the brigade's behavior intolerable speaks volumes. It demonstrates that the Dirlewanger unit occupied a unique space of horror. They were not just instruments of Nazi policy, they were a force of pure nihilistic destruction, whose cruelty and sadism managed to repel even their fellow perpetrators of atrocity. Oskar Dirlewanger himself met a fittingly grim end. He was captured after the war and reportedly beaten to death in June 1945 by Polish guards at a prison camp in Altshausen, Germany. His death, however, did not close the book on the horror his unit created. The legacy of the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger is a profoundly disturbing one, serving as a stark case study in the dangers of state-sanctioned violence. The existence of such a unit teaches us a critical lesson. When a government deliberately empowers the most criminal and sadistic elements of its society, it unleashes a force that it can barely control, a force that will inevitably spiral into unimaginable atrocity. The story of this brigade forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. It demonstrates that the capacity for extreme cruelty is not limited to a few deranged individuals. When placed in a system that removes all moral and ethical restraints and in fact rewards brutality, ordinary men, and in this case extraordinary criminals, are capable of committing acts of pure evil. The Dirlewanger unit was a social experiment in depravity, proving that when the veneer of civilization is stripped away by ideology and war, the abyss of human cruelty is bottomless. This is a terrifying but essential truth to comprehend. Remembering the Dirlewanger Brigade is also an act of duty to its countless victims. The people murdered in the villages of Belarus and the streets of Warsaw were not abstract statistics. They were individuals with lives, families, and futures that were brutally extinguished. We remember the patients killed in their hospital beds, the children burned in barns, and the families executed in their homes. By telling their story and naming the perpetrators of these crimes, we refuse to let them be forgotten. We affirm that their lives mattered, and that the injustice done to them must be acknowledged and condemned for all time. Ultimately, the history of the Dirlewanger unit is a warning that echoes through the decades. It reminds us that we must always be vigilant against the ideologies of hate that dehumanize others, as this is the first step toward justifying violence. It shows the danger of concentrating power in the hands of those who have contempt for the law and for human life. The story is dark, and the details are horrific, but it is a story that must be told. Forgetting such events makes us vulnerable to their repetition. By remembering the horrors of the Dirlewanger Brigade, we arm ourselves with the knowledge and the moral resolve to stand against such darkness wherever it may arise again.